The Pharisees and Jesus. Around 1900 years have passed since the Gospels were written. As first-century manuscripts, recorded in Greek and some Aramaic, it's inevitable that there are parts of them that are a bit, let's say, unusual to a modern reader. We are not the original audience. Perhaps one of the most unusual words in the Gospels for the modern reader is the constant reference to Pharisees. The word occurs almost 100 times in the Gospels and Acts. In the next few minutes, we're going to take a bit of a closer look at exactly who the Pharisees were, how Jesus responded to them, and what this means for you and I as we read the Bible. So let's start at the beginning. Exactly who were the Pharisees? Like all good documentaries, we probably should start with some history. In around 1300 BC, Moses climbed Mount Sinai and God revealed himself to his people Israel through the Ten Commandments, a merciful set of rules designed so God's people would know how to live holy lives pleasing to him. It was the plan that this would make God's people his image bearers who would shine his light to the nations. Fast forward 1500 years, and by this stage Israel has been exiled to Babylon and in part returned to Jerusalem. But they are now living under a series of, in some cases, oppressive foreign powers. In 63 BC, Roman forces controlled Jerusalem. The question for Israel is, how can they live as God's people in this increasingly hostile world? Well, like all groups of people, different Jewish people responded differently to the occupying forces. While the Zealots fought against Roman forces, the Essenes vacated Jerusalem, and the Sadducees assimilated with Roman powers, it was the Pharisees who remained living in Jerusalem, but focused on God's holy law. And I quote, strictly adhering to the purity laws and the laws of Moses, unquote. Joseph estimates that in the time of Jesus, there were approximately 600 Pharisees living in Jerusalem. Pharisees were lay people, and in some cases tradespeople, who were involved in synagogue communities, interpreting and teaching the law. The majority of the scribes were in fact Pharisees. One key feature of the Pharisaic tradition was that they built a hedge for the law. This was a method for protecting the law and ensuring that no letter of it was broken. Arguably, this Pharisaic tradition grew out of the effort to honour the law, and some have even argued that Pharisaism was the natural consequence and the inevitable outcome of trying to fulfill Old Testament teaching. However, for the Pharisee, the Torah included both written and unwritten law, and the Pharisee would in some cases say that the unwritten law was more important than the written. Thus, the oral teaching of the elders was held to be authoritative. Rabbi Elazar of Modin stated, "The voice of a rabbi is as the voice of God." This hedge that they built is probably best demonstrated by an example. Let's have a look at Numbers 15 verse 38. This is a commandment to Moses. "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, throughout the generations you're to make tassels on the corners of your garments with a blue cord on each tassel, that you may look upon it and remember the commandments of Jehovah and do them." To this, the scribes added a mountainous mass of oral pedantries. They argued that the fringe must consist of 4 threads and white wool, one of which must be wound around the other, as follows: 7 times with a double knot, then 8 times with a double knot, then 11 times with a double knot, then 13 times with a double knot, because 7 plus 8 plus 11 equals 26, the numerical value of the letters of Jehovah. Quite a mouthful. It's also been said that each Pharisee would try to add a new sentence to the hedge within their lifetime. As you can imagine, the hedge very quickly became very thick. Whilst this legalism is unappealing to a modern reader, it's worth mentioning that most people in first century Israel generally respected the Pharisees for their commitment to law, obedience, and purity. They represented a commoner who was seeking to follow God's holy law in a hostile world, not corrupted by desire for political power, as the Sadducees had been. Some have even argued that Jesus himself was a Pharisee who sought to purify the group from which he was a part, denouncing ceremonial religion. However, this is not the typical impression a modern reader takes of the Pharisees from the pages of the Gospels. In modern church, we've almost developed a caricature as a Pharisee as everything a Christian shouldn't be. Arguably, the goal of the Pharisee, to live a life of obedience to God's law, was a good one, and in line with the charge that Israel be God's image bearers on earth. It's important to note, Jesus didn't criticize the Pharisees for this. Instead, Jesus' criticism of the Pharisees in the Gospel is centered on their hypocrisy and legalism. That is, for focusing and increasing the requirements of the law, but forgetting justice and mercy. A great example of this is found in Mark chapter 7, verses 1 to 13. In this passage, a Pharisee asks Jesus why his disciples are eating food without washing their hands according to Pharisaic ceremonial tradition. Jesus responds in verse 6, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'These people honour me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules.'" In this passage, Jesus criticises the hedge, or the merely human rules that the Pharisees have set up, for two reasons. Because they were made up by humans, but they've been elevated to the status of the law. And secondly, because the Pharisees have twisted the laws to suit themselves in order to avoid acting in a loving and merciful way. Jesus goes on to talk about how the Pharisees fail to provide for their parents in their old age. And they justify this by finding a little loophole in the law, claiming that their money is korban, or devoted to God. In doing so, the Pharisees seek to try and follow a letter of the law and make out that this makes them pleasing to God. But they've missed the spirit of the law, which is that it's their responsibility to care for and honour their parents. They forget Micah 6:8, which explains God requires us to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. In Matthew 23, Jesus directly criticises the additional requirement of the law and hypocrisy of the Pharisees. In verse 3, he states, "Do not practice what the Pharisees preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them." Whilst Jesus' criticism of Pharisaic legalism and hypocrisy is marked, it's important not to rush to disregard the Pharisees as hopeless. Cuthbertson points out that as in any human legal system, over time, there were incidents of corruption within the Pharisaic camp. Jesus certainly addresses this corruption, but notice how he also acknowledges the authority of the Pharisees in this same passage in Matthew 23, verses 2 to 3. And I quote, "The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, so you must be careful to do everything they tell you." By this statement, Jesus appears, at the very least, to acknowledge the authority of the Pharisees as interpreters of the law. Perhaps his criticism of the Pharisees is thus stricter and more fulsome because these people have a degree of authority and thus greater responsibility to teach the truth. For this reason, Jesus makes it his effort to point out their errors in order to correct them. Also note that not all Pharisees in the Bible are exactly the same. Remember, it was a Pharisee who stood up and argued vigorously in defense of Paul in Acts chapter 23, verse 9b. "We find nothing wrong with this man," they said. Gamaliel is also named in Acts 5 verse 34 as a teacher of the law who was honoured by all the people, who defends Peter and the other apostles before the Sanhedrin, stating, "Leave these men alone, let them go, for if their purpose is of human activity, it will fail. But if it is from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You will only find yourself fighting against God." It's important to read the nuance in the Bible and not be tempted to easy caricatures or creating a simple fairy tale of good and evil. The truth is, human beings are complex, as were the Pharisees. No doubt, Jesus is very critical of Pharisees who resorted to legalism, created burdens for others, and showed no mercy. Yet, there are also instances of Pharisees who champion the apostles before their fellow Pharisees, and this surely shows that, like any group of people, the Pharisees cannot be characterized as entirely hypocritical and unjust. What does this mean for you and I? Walk humbly, act justly, love mercy. Absolutely. Seek to honour God with righteousness by following the law, yes. But make sure at all times we're doing the first thing, which is to love. And the greatest command is this: love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind, and love your neighbour as yourself.